Hey, listeners, and welcome to episode 594 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am delighted to have you joining me today to hear stories and insights from today's guest, Dr. Yasmin Hurd. We are rebroadcasting her interview this week, and it was originally published on April 8th of 2015. Listeners, Yasmin is a talented translational neuroscientist whose research examines how genes and the environment contribute and interact in the development of addictive disorders. Her work aims to unravel the underlying neurobiological mechanisms in order to advance treatments and interventions for these diseases. So everyone, I hope you are ready for more inspiration and insights from Yasmin as we get ready to dive into this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. Yasmin Hurd. So thank you so much for joining us today, Yasmin. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Great to have you on the show, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners out there, Yasmin is a professor in the departments of Psychiatry, Neuroscience, as well as Pharmacology and Systems Therapeutics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She's also the director of the Center for Addictive Disorders, the Ward-Coleman Chair in Translational Neuroscience, and the former director of the MD-PhD program there. Now, Yasmin received her PhD in medical science from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and she spent time as a Pharmacology Research Associate Fellow with the NIH, as well as a fellow staff member at the National Institute of Mental Health. And afterward, Yasmin returned to the Karolinska Institute, where she remained as a faculty member for 13 years before coming to Mount Sinai. Now, Yasmin is a member of the American Society for Neuroscience, the New York Academy of Sciences, and the College on Problems of Drug Dependence. And she is here with us today, listeners, to tell us about her journey through life and science. So, Yasmin, today we are excited to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
It seems like I spend a lot of my time doing science.
Understandable.
Yeah. The funny thing is that no matter what time I get home after that long day, I think cooking is my major outlet. I love food. I love food. I love food, and I love cooking it. So it's funny because when the TV show Chopped, I don't know if you know it.
Oh, yeah. I love that show.
I love that show. And I feel like Chopped was my life because whenever I get home and whatever is in the pantry, I find a way to make something, and I hope delicious. And my friends, I have dinner parties, 5-course meals. I just love cooking. So I think that to me relaxes me the most. And I also love to paint. Painting, though, I feel like I need more downtime to really get into whatever piece I'm working on. Cooking is easier to get into, and obviously on a more daily basis than my painting. Those are the two things I think that really grounds me.
Very cool. Well, wonderful to hear about how you spend your free time. And I can totally relate to this description of sort of feeling like you're on the show Chopped when you have to open your fridge and try and make a meal out of whatever's in there. I've been in that position many times. So great to hear about your interests in cooking and painting. Now, tell us a little bit more about your painting. Are there particular things that you like to paint, like landscapes, portraits?
It's funny. I love the human body. And even though my friends call me a prude, I started many years ago when I was a student painting the human body, and then over the years I have also gotten a little into landscapes, but I think a combination. It depends on what mood I'm in, but oil painting was the media that I use the most, but I've tried to expand over the years.
Well, I like it. Anatomy and biology as art, Yasmin, that sounds wonderful. So now diving into your scientific side a little bit more, can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who might not be familiar with your area of science?
So as a neuroscientist, studying the brain, and my particular question relates to the field of addiction. I mean, many people understand addiction. I think in this country we have over 40 million people who are addicted to some form of nicotine, alcohol, or other drugs. And it's a disorder that there's a lot of controversy and stigma whether or not people become addicted because they have a lack of free will. But as a neuroscientist, I want to know, how does a drug impact the brain, and to identify the neurobiology of vulnerability. And what I mean by that is many people will try drugs, but only a certain percentage go on to have a substance abuse or psychiatric illness. And so my research, I studied the human brain, and most of the research deals with studying the postmortem human brain. So addiction, unfortunately, there is high mortality with a number of the substances. And I will study what are the molecular changes in specific parts of the brain that are characteristic for that particular substance abuse, and how information we know about the individual, such as their genetics, can help provide insights into which of these molecular changes are relevant to disease vulnerability and perhaps targets for developing treatments. And then we use that information to really guide our animal translational work, where we try to recapitulate the molecular disturbances that we see in our human subjects, and then use the animal models where we can follow the trajectory of these changes and can go in and do mechanistic causal studies where we can modulate, change a particular transmitter or protein and see what effects that might have on drug self-administration behavior.
Well, Yasmin, you are doing some fascinating research and really important with so many people really across the world being affected by substance abuse and addiction. So I'm looking forward to chatting more about some of the details of your research as we go through the interview. But let me ask you first about motivation. I know a lot of scientists have so much to do in the day that it's hard to stay motivated sometimes. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying that you pull out when you are seeking motivation that really helps you get through?
You know, there's so many. It's funny. I was thinking about this. A lot of my motivation seems to be something to do with working. Like, for example, Maya Angelou, she had been saying, like, nothing will work unless you do. And so no matter if it's something small, you have to be really part of that work, I always feel. And something always seems impossible until it's done. I think that those are some of the daily things that get me through the day. I'm generally motivated to get through some of the days, but I think how I carry out my research, I think the saying, it's funny, Einstein had a number of things that's always resonated, but one for me, I think it was one where he said something about, you know, people say that it's intellect which makes a great scientist, but that they're wrong. It's character.
I like that.
That I think resonates perhaps the most with me, of how do you carry out your research and how do you treat the people with whom you're in your team and who you're working with and patients and so on. And I think that that to me has significant value.
Fantastic motivational quotes, Yasmin. I like all of those. And I particularly like this first when you mentioned the nothing will work unless you do. And that's something that I've heard someone say before, and it kind of stuck with me as well. I'm like, okay, I can complain about it all I want, but until I start working on it, it's not going to get done. So
exactly.
Fantastic quotes there. Now let's chat a little bit about some of the people who've inspired you over the course of your career and over the course of your life. I love hearing about scientists' role models. So can you tell us about yours? I
think I have different types of role models. Like, for example, I think my work ethics really come from my mother, who's this workaholic in part. She's not a scientist, nothing like that. But I think that she lived that saying by Maya Angelou, that nothing will work unless you do. And I think how she lives her life in terms of, she was always like, you know, don't be a stereotype. You got to work hard. She's my role model in a lot of things. A professor in college, Peter Donovic, he was a role model to me. He's great. And he was a role model because of how he respected the students and the people in his group and the motivation that he gave. And just someone believing in you and how they treated others in terms of, how do you ask the question of science? How do you go about addressing it? And more importantly, like I said, how do you respect people? I've always been really impressed by him, and he was definitely a role model for me.
Wonderful. I like hearing about these different categories of role models that you have. And you mentioned someone like Maya Angelou, who you really look up to on a number of different aspects, just being an inspirational figure. And then also this professor, someone who you were able to work with a little bit more closely, who was able to teach you how to operate more on a day-to-day basis. And I really like these examples that you've given. And I'm curious to hear about where your interest in science began, Yasmin. Can you take us back all the way to the beginning and tell us what first sparked your curiosity and interest in science?
I have to say, I was a weird kid.
You're not alone. Me too.
And so I was born in Jamaica, and I don't fit the stereotype of what a neuroscientist looks like. And obviously, even back then, definitely not. But I know from when I was small, it's really strange to say, well, I've always loved science, but I always wanted to know how the brain works or why people were how they were. And I knew it was because of something was wrong in their brain. And people even remind me that I used to say those kinds of strange things as a child. And so, like I said, I was definitely weird. And I think that being a scientist, I don't know if I would have become a scientist if I wasn't born in Jamaica, where I think everybody kind of looks the same. When I came to the US, and I think, again, I was a Black girl liking science. And that was very unusual. And so I think that, not fitting a certain characteristic of what a scientist should look like, I think coming from Jamaica, that definitely helped me, that I started off with a group of people who looked like me. When I went to the university, I went to Binghamton University in upstate New York. They did something I thought really great then. I loved biochemistry and I loved psychology. And they allowed me to combine and make a new degree. And that was very unusual. People didn't do that then. And ironically, that degree or that combination many years later turned into the neuroscience field.
You were the trailblazer there. I like it.
Yeah. And so, again, it was being allowed to kind of go my path and put things together that I really liked. And then when I was in Sweden doing my doctorate, every time I wanted to learn something new, I was allowed to do it by the people. My thesis advisor there, his name is Urban Ungerstad. He's very renowned neuroscientist who had helped map a particular neurotransmitter systems in the brain. He had helped develop a Parkinson animal model. He had started to develop a technique to measure in vivo transmitters in the living brain. And I wanted to combine that with behavior in terms of what do these fluctuations mean during behavior and in relation to addiction. And he allowed me to learn that, or to at least attempt to do it. And when I was a postdoc at NIH, again, for me, I wanted to know if all the things I was studying in our animal models were really relevant to the human brain and to human disease, because I felt if we were studying things that weren't really relevant, why bother? Mm-hmm. And my mentor at that time, my advisor, he said, go ahead and try and study it. He didn't think it was going to work, but I started studying the human brain and studying molecular changes, and people said you can't do that in the human brain. And I was able to do that. And now that's something that many people do. And I think that the path, when I look back, it was kind of being different and being allowed to be different. And to the things that I thought about trying to attempt, the mentors and advisors along the road allowed me to do it.
Yasmin, this story that you've just shared with myself and our listeners out there is wonderful. I really like this theme that's kind of been coming through as, not being afraid to be different, not being afraid to take chances, not being afraid to step outside the norm. And I think you brought up a really good point about not feeling like you fit what a normal scientist looks like. And that's something we're hoping to inspire all of our listeners out there. If you're out there listening and you don't feel like you fit what a normal scientist looks like, or you don't feel like your path is that of a normal scientist, I think we're trying to show people that there is no normal now. A lot of people are getting into science in a variety of different ways and going a lot of different directions with it, from some unconventional paths in some cases. So wonderful story. Now, can you dive into some more of the details of the research you're doing right now? Maybe share a project with us that you are so excited to be working on.
There are a number of projects that I really love. One of the studies that we started doing a number of years ago was looking at the developmental effects of marijuana. And we normally looked at the effects of prenatal or adolescent exposure to THC, which is a psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. And we would look at molecular and behavioral effects. But one day I wanted to know what happens. Does it just stop there within their lifetime, does it have any impact on subsequent generations? And I actually didn't think that it would, just wanted to see. And so one of my postdocs, she took on the challenge, and it really is a challenge, and started to look at the transgenerational effects of marijuana. And it's been quite fascinating. So that we see effects that you can see in the adult offspring. These are animal studies, but where the parents were exposed to marijuana during adolescence. They weren't exposed themselves, these adult offspring, or the next generation. And yet still, we see molecular changes across the genome, and we see behavioral effects that are relevant to aspects of impairment of reward, goal-directed behavior, aspects of perhaps negative affective traits. So it's fascinating how the life experience of an individual gets transmitted to subsequent generations. And we're trying to understand the mechanisms by which that occurred. When I was in school, you learned that whatever happened to you during your lifetime, you really pass on only the DNA sequence to your offspring, and not we call it the epigenetic changes that basically gets wiped off when you have a child. You transmit, like I said, only the DNA sequence of how genes and proteins are read. And now we know that that isn't true. And so we're, as I said, trying to figure out the mechanisms by which this occur. And I think that that's one exciting area of research that we're working on.
Well, this is really interesting and sort of opposite of what I would have expected as well. Now, do you see that these effects are diluted maybe as you move generationally further along from the original exposure, or do they sort of persist similarly?
So they're a little different. And this is the thing that, again, is interesting, because all of us, we take our genetics and now perhaps some of the experiences, but what happens to us during our lifetime? So if you then might have a subsequent stress in your lifetime, you then, with the previous history, can respond a little differently. So we see that in some generations, you have some similarities and then some other things that are showing up. But to me, there seems to be a dimensionality of the traits that you see across the different generations. And that's what we're studying in terms of which particular traits get diluted and which particular traits are strengthened.
Well, this, I think, opens up a lot of doors for considering maybe not just substance of abuse, but all kinds of different experiences that might be happening further upstream. I'm thinking about, my parents' lives. What did they experience in terms of stresses, in terms of other things they may have encountered, and how that might be affecting myself in future generations? This is very, very interesting.
Absolutely. I don't think that this relates really to substance abuse at all. I think that this is about perhaps certain very potent types of stresses to the system that gets transmitted. And I think that our animal study just tells us what's possible. The environment in which you were raised can help counter some of the things you might have inherited. So it doesn't mean that this will happen, but it emphasizes the complexity of what we think or who we think we are, and that it's not only genetics.
Absolutely. Well, very interesting work that you're doing now in the lab, Yasmin. And I think so far we've talked about a lot of the great things on careers in science. We haven't yet talked about some of the struggles, some of the low points. And I know every scientist goes through these periods, and it might be days, hours, but it might be longer, weeks or months, where it seems like things are just going wrong. And I think there are certain ways that you can productively get through these tough times, and we like to share them with our listeners just in case they are going through similar experiences. So can you tell us about a tough time in your career, Yasmin, and how you got through it to be successful?
Perhaps two things. I think on the day-to-day or week-to-week or even a month-to-month, I think one thing as scientists, we have to accept and acknowledge that it's a little bit, things go up and things will go down. And in science, you're asking a question. You design experiments, and most of those experiments will fail because we're trying to really delve into something much more complex than we realize. So I think acknowledging that, and if you're open to realizing that many experiments will fail, you will succeed much more.
Right.
The lows won't be as low. I think it's really expecting it. The thing that's tough is when you've worked on an experiment for months and months and even a year and realize that there was an error earlier in the initial phases of the experiment that was missed. And so all those months and even a year worth of data could be lost. Those things are really, really, really difficult. But usually errors that we make, we do learn a lot from them, just like in regular life. I think in science, a lot of the errors make a big difference. But I think in terms of my life struggle-wise, I think it comes back to struggling that you don't fit the characteristics, because people try to put labels on everyone. And sometimes, those can be a big burden where you are expected to fail because you look a certain way, come from a certain background. And that can put a lot of stress on you. And I think a lot of kids I see that come from similar backgrounds as I did, sometimes they fail because you start to believe what other people put on you. And I think the thing that you have to remember is that you're there for a reason. And, the reason was your love and passion for science. And you can't let other people put you in a box, because then you will only achieve what they want you to achieve. You're not going to achieve your full potential. So for me, I think it's like, as a scientist especially, you don't want to be put in a box, and you don't want to limit yourself or to be the description of what other people have of you. You need to create your own identity. And I think that helps you through the tough times.
I think, Yasmin, you were bringing up some really important points here. So were there times in your career where you started second guessing yourself, or did you think about moving a different direction because you didn't feel like you fit in, or you didn't feel like you fit what other people were expecting?
Oh, absolutely. A number of times. And I have to say, one of the things actually interestingly about going to Sweden, which I had not planned in my career. I mean, again, science and life takes you, and it's really good to follow it. But being in Sweden helped me a lot, because I wasn't blonde hair, blue-eyed, and I wasn't Swedish, and I wasn't supposed to belong. And because of that, I didn't have any pressure. I could actually just focus on my science. And that part, when you don't have to belong and you let go, you then succeed. And I don't know if I'm explaining it well for your listeners, but I think that, as I said, the unconscious biases from around you, you start to take on. And when you start to believe something negative, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I really do think that people spend too much time listening to others. And that, to me, is one of the reasons why they're not successful, because they start believing the negative. And as I said before, I think, science, there are a lot of misses, in terms of the baseball analogies. You're going to strike out a lot, but you won't hit that home run if you're not trying to strike the ball, And I think that that's one of the things for me.
Absolutely. Well, Yasmin, wonderful to hear that you persisted despite some of these doubts that you had, some of this insecurity that you had. And I think these feelings of insecurity, maybe inferiority, maybe feeling like you don't fit in, you're not good enough, are common in a lot of scientists, maybe to different degrees, depending on your background, depending on your situation. But I think these are things that a lot of scientists have to overcome. So I'm really glad you brought this up in our discussion. Just making sure that you believe in yourself, knowing that you're there because you are passionate and you want to do this, and not really worrying about what other people think. So glad to hear that you had one of these experiences that you were able to overcome in a positive way. So we don't just want to talk about some of the struggles, some of the tough times that scientists go through. I really like to celebrate all the successes in science. So can you share with us next one of your own success stories? And this can be one of the big victories, grants, papers, awards, things like that, or even just a little victory along the way.
I think I've been so happy with the course of my career, and just think that I'm blessed in a lot of ways, because I think that the successes have definitely outnumbered the failures. And like I said, the successes are even better in terms of the number of grants that I have been successful in being able to attain for the research questions, even in times when it's been challenging from NIH and many scientists. So I think that that's one thing for me that I'm very proud of. Also, I think that my research has led to a number of new lines of investigations that other scientists have taken, even though in the beginning people told me this is not possible to do. And we were able to prove that that was incorrect. And now other scientists are following that line of research, even from aspects of looking at the developmental effects of drugs and transgenerational effects, and even studying the postmortem human brain and studying molecular changes in that. and different techniques that I helped to develop. So for me, I think being persistent definitely has helped, and I feel it has led to more successes than failures.
Certainly. Well, I love these two different types of successes that you're mentioning. Certainly, getting grant funding is huge right now. So congratulations on successfully getting those grants to fund your research. And I particularly like this success that you're describing of almost these I told you so moments where you were able to make something possible that people thought could not be done. So can you tell us about one of these experiences, one of these moments where you had accomplished or your lab had accomplished something that people thought couldn't be done, and how you guys celebrated it or responded to that moment of success where you realized you did it?
Well, one is very, very old. For example, when I was a student, we were trying to measure transmitters in animals that were behaving and actually self-administering a drug. So an example of that time, it was cocaine. And it was technically challenging at that time. Actually, it still is.
Yeah.
And when we were able to combine and to actually measure these transmitters while animals were self-administering the drug, it was definitely quite rewarding for us who were involved. And also, I remember reviews back from journals. And I remembered we were studying the postmortem brain and looking at actually estrogen receptors expression in the brain. And a reviewer said we had males' brains as well. We were studying males as well. And they were like, there are no estrogen receptors in the male brain, which was crazy. Mm-hmm. And so, it's strange that it seems so small now, but they were big. And when you get back reviews and that where someone may reject your paper because they believe that this can't be done, it felt good to be able to prove them wrong.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful to hear that you've had these moments and that you're really pushing past the bounds of what people think can be done. I think that's so important in science. So great to hear about these successes that you've had. And I know a lot of scientists stay so busy with the work that you're doing. And you mentioned in the beginning, you spend quite a bit of your time doing science. And that doesn't always leave a lot of time for the balancing act of everything else that you're trying to fit it into your life. But I know a lot of scientists are reading enthusiasts, and I have gotten just some fantastic books to add to my own reading list from our guests on our show. So Yasmin, I'm going to ask you today, can you tell us about a book that you've read and just really enjoyed that you think myself and our listeners should check out?
So for me, I don't think that there's one book particularly. I love murder mysteries. I love solving murders. So I think, the classics for me are Agatha Christie, P.D. James, Steve Larson. Of those, I can't really choose one. A book, though, that resonated a lot to me, and mainly because on a more global scientific level, Galileo. I know it's getting weird to say, but have you ever read Galileo's Daughter?
I haven't. I'll have to check it out.
By Deva Sobel. So she writes in a historical perspective, and there were letters between Galileo and his daughter. And Galileo had significance for me. In fact, I even forced my nephew when we went to Florence to visit his tomb because he really was, in a way, the father of modern science. I mean, in terms of hypothesis, that you can't just say something is so, you have to prove it. And what should be the strategy for hypothesis testing? And it was really great reading this book and just seeing some of the things he went through, because he was one of the people who believed that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe and, was arrested for that. And, you forget how our science has evolved. And I just love the way in which she wrote the story from the human perspective of him as a person and the relationships, but in the background of the historical level as well. So I think that book is one that I really love. But if I'm completely honest, the book I probably would give to everybody is Dr. Seuss, The Places You'll Go.
I love that book. I have a copy myself.
That helped me through so many. Probably I should have said that as one of my motivational quotes. That has helped me through a lot. It's very funny.
Absolutely. Well, so many great recommendations, Yasmin. I myself am a murder mystery fan as well, so I love the Agatha Christie books. And definitely this one about Galileo's daughter sounds fantastic. I mean, I think Galileo is absolutely one of the earliest proponents of the scientific method, but I myself don't know much about his family life or a lot of the circumstances that surrounded it. You just sort of have those couple bullet points of history that you remember from one of your science history classes. So very cool recommendation. Now, we'll put that out there for our listeners to check out if they want to add it to their reading lists as well. And I know scientists get a lot of time to work on research, but one of the other aspects of the job that's really enjoyable are some of the opportunities that you get to travel. And scientists get to travel to different places for different reasons, either conferences, to work with collaborators. You traveled actually quite a bit for your training. So can you think back on all the places that you've been for science and tell us about your favorite?
Well, there's so many. And that's one thing I do think that, when you're going into science, you never think about. It's so international. Mm-hmm. It opens up the world for you. And I wish young people realize that. And perhaps they do more now with the internet, available. I've been to so many international conferences and made friends all over the world. I'm trying to think of, perhaps when I was younger. I mean, there's so many that are great, really great. And I always tell students to go to the smaller conferences. Usually, I think that the experiences in those smaller conferences are really better for the science. They improve your network, and you usually get to experience those cities much better. But when I was younger, I used to love going to a conference called ACNP, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. And it used to be held in Puerto Rico. And I think every fifth year they had it in Hawaii. And I remember just sitting on the beach among the top people in my field. And it was a small conference and everyone was just available and accessible to you. And you're talking science in a beautiful place. And that really resonated a lot to me. And I was really so happy to be a scientist, to be able to travel and to have these one-on-one and in a small conference with these icons in the field.
Absolutely. I think it's sort of a humbling, but also kind of an exhilarating experience to be surrounded by these giants in the field, your sort of science heroes and heroines, and being able to just walk up to them and start talking. And they're totally open to it and excited to talk science with you in these small conference settings. So great description of your experiences there. Now, when you were in Puerto Rico, or maybe if you had gone the years they were in Hawaii, did they do little excursions or things where you could maybe get outside the conference hall a little bit?
Yes. And that's one of the things I think is really great. I like downhill skiing and some of the small ones in Europe and the Alps. I mean, amazing. So they have you ski for most of the day, and it's the morning and the evening that you have your sessions, and it's really great. So you get to experience the country, you get to experience physical activity, plus get phenomenal science.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I know I myself am a little terrified to try downhill skiing, especially somewhere like Europe where the mountains are, Bunny Hill might be in quotation marks there, right?
But they're beautiful. Oh my gosh. That's when you believe in a God, when you see this, like the Grand Canyon, that kind of feeling, the beauty of that nature.
Well, it sounds absolutely beautiful and wonderful to hear that you've had so many of these great science travel opportunities. And I think that's something that a lot of young people who are maybe considering science or other fields don't realize. So it's something we like to highlight on our program, just all these great opportunities you have to form international friendships, international collaborations, and certainly see the world while sharing your science. And I know in addition to some of the travel opportunities you get these opportunities, like we're describing here, for collaborating, for meeting wonderful people. And I think over the course of your training, you get to work in a lot of different laboratories, and you come to find that a lot of different laboratories have their own personalities and a lot of quirky traditions that often go along with them and are passed down through the generations. So can you share with us today, Yasmin, one of these traditions that you've experienced, or maybe one that you currently have in your lab right now, or even just a funny science memory?
In Sweden, there were a number of different cultural things that I really enjoyed, but I don't think I've really brought them back to New York. I do remember when I was a postdoc, every year, the mentor of the lab, we would have like a pasta party, and he'd make this pesto from the basil from his garden. And then we found out that he had used the blender that we have for brains. I was like, wait a second.
Oh, no. Just a little extra protein. You'll be fine.
I think that food is always the common thing, if I think back in, every place. So actually, I will take that back. With that said, one of the things when I was in Sweden that we used to have as a lab ritual was actually Thanksgiving. I missed that holiday when I was in Europe. And so that day, everyone came to my apartment with their families and so on, and it was wonderful. And so when I left, everybody, my old students and postdocs and the assistants in my group, that was one thing everybody really lamented, the sadness of my going and that ritual. So we always gave thanks when I was in Sweden, and the lab we went through, the things that we were thankful for. And so bringing Thanksgiving to them, I felt was really great.
Well, I think that is an awesome tradition to start. I like this aspect of really bringing some of your culture there with you for others to experience. So great to hear about some of these traditions you've had, or even just sort of fond memories of the different places that you've worked. And I think it's so important to also point out that, scientists like to have fun. We're very serious about our research, but there are a lot of these great experiences that go along with science that are not necessarily related to the science and the research. It's about enjoying the time you're spending with great company. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us today. And I know while you're maybe sitting at these lab gatherings or talking to some of your colleagues, it's kind of fun to talk about these big what if questions and these things that you would love to research if there were no barriers. So Yasmin, can you tell us if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility, all these things that are restricting research today, were not an issue? What is the one question that you are just dying to know the answer to?
I think for me, it comes back to the heterogeneity of the brain that is so beautiful and complex. And if we had the technology, we're developing it, we're definitely not close to this at all, but being able to understand the chemical makeup of specific cells that make up a specific pathway that relates to a specific behavior and can go in and genetically modify that particular cell and only that particular cell and its protein, so we would decrease any type of side effects by the medications we develop and really treat neurological illnesses in a way we can't do today. So until we know the absolute phenotype of this individual heterogeneous cells and the pathways they make up in the brain, I would love to know that and put that in the context of the genetics and the epigenetic platform on which they reside, so that we could go in and then specifically target just that particular cell.
Well, this is a fantastic research question, maybe a proposed project of being able to really start zooming in at that really small scale cellular level, but then being able to apply it broadly in terms of looking at pathways and then genetics and epigenetics. So very, very interesting. So what would you say right now is the biggest thing keeping you from moving the right direction in this type of project? Is it something like feasibility of getting that really fine scale measurement, or is it maybe a funding restriction or a technology problem?
I think it's technology and the money needed to develop that technology. I think that different labs are trying to work on that, but we're still a ways away. But I think that people are thinking in this way, but technologically we're just not there.
Gotcha. Well, very interesting food for thought for myself and our listeners out there. And I think in addition to talking about these big what if questions, a lot of scientists enjoy some great opportunities to get advice from brilliant people along their journey. So we are going to try and learn from you and the people who taught you. Can you tell us what is the best piece of advice you've ever received, Yasmin?
For me, scientifically, the data is the data. And that's one thing I always say in my group, and they always tease me, but I can't remember where that started. But for me, the data is the data. And as scientists, we need to not overinterpret what we get. I think when we deviate from that, we then go down false paths. I think for me, on a personal level, advice, a long time ago, actually from a friend, when I was trying to decide if I was going to accept a particular position, because I felt, they might just be offering it to me because I'm a woman or that I'm Black or both. And she was like, are you crazy? You've worked for this. And people will always believe what they want to believe. And if you continue to work and do well in the job, the next person and the person after that, who looks like they won't even think about it. And I think that this has been an advice for me that has been good, to not think about what other people are thinking of you, or work hard and accept whatever job luckily gets thrown your way.
Absolutely. Well, Yasmin, two really great pieces of advice for our listeners out there. I think definitely as a scientist, it's hard not to get emotionally invested or sort of over involved in your own interpretations of the data. You sort of have to take it at face value sometimes. And then I really like this piece of advice you're giving just in terms of accepting opportunities and sort of not making excuses for your own success, and really just owning it and definitely paving the way for the people to come after you. So great to hear these little pieces of advice that have helped you along the way, Yasmin. Now, can you share one last piece of advice, or maybe just a few inspiring words for our listeners today, now coming from you?
I think the path is by stepping out of your comfort zone, both as a person and as a scientist. I think that a lot of scientists do a lot of Me Too kind of research. And if we're going to make any major discoveries, it's for stepping out of that box scientifically. But also, I think in terms of personally, in terms of being brave and stepping out of your comfort zone, I think that's when you succeed and find the path that's really for you.
Wonderful advice, Yasmin, and well said. Listeners, don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone, and don't be afraid to be daring in science or in the path that you're taking, the career that you're taking. So thank you so much for all the insights you've shared with us today, Yasmin. Can you tell our listeners now how they can get in touch with you to learn more about the work that you're doing?
It's easy to go to the Mount Sinai Icahn School of Medicine website and type my name, Yasmin Hurd. There are not that many of me around.
Gotcha.
And also by email, my email address is Yasmin, YASMIN.Hurd, HURD, at M as in Mary, S as in Sam, M as in Mary.edu. So I'm glad to speak to anyone having questions about science and their careers.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate it, Yasmin. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you again. And thank you to our listeners out there. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.